Hi, welcome to another edition of hand-laid tracks and 3D printed trains with Socrates. Today we're going to answer a user question. Craig Snyder asked about the number 6 turnouts and anything I could do to help him because he's building a large layout with 80 plus turnouts that he's hand building using the Fast Tracks jig system. And so I'm not personally using the 6s, although I do have the 3-way jig. So I'm here to help Craig. This is what I designed for my 3-ways, 6s, turnouts, number 6 turnouts, is a tie cutter. This is, to me, the most troublesome step in building the turnouts is cutting the ties. Because you see, a basic turnout is a lattice work. You have basically 6 rails and 2 guard rails, but you have 2 stock rails, 2 diverging rails that go back and forth, and then the 2 frog rails that produce a frog point. And to tie them all together, you have copper cross ties. And these are 2-sided PCB board with copper on both sides and a fiberglass PCB board, which is an insulator between them. And you use them to solder the tracks together. But you then have to cut a gap in between each of the 2 sides because one rail is positive and the other rail is negative because it's a DC powered system. And if you don't cut that gap, you have a dead short and you'll just simply blow up the electronics. So once you've soldered these together, or beforehand, you have to clip a little gap between them. So you start with a PCB board like this, and you cut them into, or you cut them off into small little ties, and then you have to make them the proper length, depending where on the turnout you're doing it, because along the turnout, each piece has a different specific length. So you then have to cut each one to length, and then you have to put the gaps in all the right places. And to do that is really quite a lot of work. That's why I came up with the tie gap cutter and gapper. It's a 2-piece part. It has a little plastic holder where you slip in your ties, and then you clip them all to length based on the top. You give them a quick file, and then you slip the cover around the entire thing, which holds them all in place. And then using a triangle file, you go down the grooves and you cut the gap into each of the different ties. The important thing to remember is one of the ties has 3 gaps. It's the tie just past the divergence and just on the right side or just past the isolation gap. And that tie has 3 gaps. And this is really why I did this, because that 3rd gap is so hard to get in the right place. If you put it in the wrong place, you end up with a short. And if you also put it in the wrong place, you can make it very difficult to solder that rail down to the tie. So that gap's important, and you'll see it says 2nd gap because that's the tie you have to put in 2nd place. And worst case scenario, you'll make 2 of the same tie because you fill in both of them, which I've done, and then you have an extra tie at that point. But you have to move it into both places and then gap it twice, that one tie. So the idea that the jig is to make the gaps as close to perfect as possible and as easy as possible. This is a slightly older one that I had. It doesn't have the little windows put into it yet. But I'm using the Fast Tracks copper ties. I snip on the one side a couple and then I flip it over and snip the other side. That way they're all in the one direction because one's got a clean end and the other end has to be quickly filed. And the reason I do that is that way I can put into one tie into the hole, snip it, and flip it over and put it back in the other direction, and both have a clean end inside the jig. Usually the cutoff piece fits, if not perfectly, nearly perfectly somewhere else on the jig, so that's what I'm trying to figure out where each one of the ties fits. I hadn't done this particular turnout in a while. This is actually a number 4 because I'm not using number 6s, but it's essentially the identical idea behind it. And once you've gotten all of them clipped and flipped into there, the next step will be simply to go ahead and file them down to length, which you don't need to do too much on these things because the ties themselves are pretty soft, and you know, even snip, they don't look that bad, but I'm trying to keep it as clean as possible. So towards the end of it, I wanted to make sure that I wasn't, if you cut them too short, you end up wasting, so I used a couple of whole ties and flipped them and that way I had usable pieces left over. At that point you slip it into the outer case, which holds the pieces into the position, because before they would move around. I then use a triangle file and I gap the one extra gap and move that tie into the other position. So I do the other two gaps on that one because that's part of the diverging rail, and I say the one just past the isolation cut where you have to cut with the jeweler's saw. And with the triangle file, go down the diverging path and down the straight path. I usually do it inside my lit up magnifying glass, my magnifying glass light. That way I can really see what's going on, and I can clearly see that the ties have been cut, and you can see that they're all nicely cut through and make a nice little gap in the right place. And after that, the only step is to put them into the jig and go ahead and solder them. And this to me is a huge time saver. It not only makes a difficult job easier, it makes the quality much, much better. If you look at my first video where I made the first turnout, I did the whole thing by hand. It took a very long time and the quality was adequate at best. So something that takes extra time to do a bad job, well, that just doesn't make any sense in my book. So I came up with a thing that you can 3D print. It's available on Thingiverse. You make it yourself, and if you have to, you can adjust it, because this particular one is made for the three-way. So I think a couple of the ties are going to be in the wrong place. So worst case scenario, you'll have to hand do one tie, and you can also adjust the file. Maybe I'll go ahead and change it myself, but I don't have a 6-way turnout to check on it specifically, but it's not that hard based on some of the drawings. Anyway, check it out on Thingiverse. If you like it, please hit like on Thingiverse and like and subscribe here. It helps a lot with the algorithms, because algorithms are, I don't know, algorithmic. So thanks for watching, and again, it's still summer, so yep, it's hot in here. Netherlands, it's actually hot. Global warming. It's not bad here. Anyway, starting to get the time saver together too. Slowly. Very, very, very slowly.